they're still relevant in the skeletal system, even when we're discussing bone. Then you'll need to be able to describe the major functions of the skeletal system. We'll move on to the gross anatomy, and you'll need to be able to name the major regions of the skeleton, so the axial and appendicular skeleton, and compare the 4 bone shape classes and provide examples of each. You'll need to be able to describe the gross anatomy of the flat bone versus the long bone, indicate the locations and functions of red and yellow bone marrow, define articular cartilage, periosteum, and endosteum, and indicate the functional importance of bone markings. Then we'll move on to skeletal histology, where we will look at the structure, function, and location of compact versus spongy bone. You'll need to be able to describe the osteon and the key structures within it. You'll need to know the key cells of the bony tissue, so that is osteocytes, osteoblasts, and osteoclasts. Apologies, osteoblast is here twice, but they are very important, and know the key roles of these cells. Then you'll also need to be able to identify the role of collagen and calcium in bone tissue composition. Looking at cartilages of the skeletal system, or the structure of skeletal cartilages. Also, apologies for that bar that keeps popping up at the bottom. I have no idea why that is happening, or how to get it to stop. So, it'll just be a little surprise every once in a while. So, before bone actually makes up our skeleton, your skeleton is initially made of cartilage. And then after bone takes over where that cartilage was, you still have cartilage that remains in the skeletal system, and it's going to be in areas that need to be flexible. So the cartilage of the skeletal system is avascular, so it doesn't contain any blood vessels. It's non-innervated, so no nerves, can't feel anything in the cartilage. Then we have our perichondrium, which is how the cartilage actually gets nourishment. So the perichondrium is this outer covering on either side of our cartilage. So if we look at this image right here, we have hyaline cartilage here in the middle, and then on either side we have a thick layer of perichondrium. So peri means around, and chondrium or chondro means cartilage, so around our cartilage. It's actually made up of dense, irregular connective tissue. And this is how the cartilage actually gets your nourishment. So we have blood vessels and nourishment, nutrients going through the perichondrium that will diffuse into the cartilage as needed. So the perichondrium helps to protect our cartilage, and it helps to contain the cartilage. So if there's any outward expansion in the cartilage itself, the perichondrium is going to resist that expansion and keep the cartilage where it needs to be. And again, it also has the blood supply where our cartilage gets its nourishment. We have our 3 types of cartilage that we also discussed in lab. That's our hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. So our hyaline cartilage, that is actually the most abundant skeletal cartilage that we have in the body. And it provides support, but also allows there to be some flexibility and resilience to certain movements. And we have 4 types of hyaline cartilage in the body. So we have articular cartilages, and that's going to be cartilage that covers the ends of bones, where bone meets other bone. So in this image right here, your hyaline cartilage is going to be blue. So the articular cartilage we're going to see in the joints of our elbow, in the joint in our shoulder. So it's going to cover the end of those bones that touch each other. We'll see it between all of the bones in our wrist and in our fingers, in our hips, where our femur goes into our pelvis, in our ankles and in our toes. Then we have costal cartilage. So your costal cartilage is the cartilage that connects your ribs to your sternum. So right in here, the blue that you're seeing between the bones in your rib cage and your sternum. That's your costal cartilage. Then our respiratory cartilages. So that's going to be our larynx. Our trachea is made up of hyaline cartilage rings, and the bronchi and the lungs are made up of cartilage as well. Then our fourth type of hyaline cartilage in the body is the cartilage in your nose. So your nasal cartilages. It's another type of hyaline cartilage. So again, the most abundant cartilage in the body. It provides resilience and resistance against some movements, but it also has to be flexible. That's our hyaline cartilage. Next, we have our elastic cartilage. So our elastic cartilage, the fibers that make up the elastic cartilage are the elastic fibers that allow this cartilage to be somewhat stretchy, so it stands up to repeated bending. So our elastic cartilage in this image is going to be green, and we have two areas where you will find your elastic cartilage. So the cartilage of the external ear is elastic cartilage, and then if we come over here, our epiglottis, right here, your epiglottis is the flap of cartilage that covers your trachea when you're swallowing and opens up your esophagus for your food to actually pass through. So your epiglottis bends quite often. When you're eating or when you're swallowing, it's going to bend and cover that trachea. So that's the only two areas where we will find our elastic cartilage. And then we have our fibrocartilage, our third and final type of cartilage in the skeletal system. So your fibrocartilage is going to be in areas that need to be able to stretch, but also resist compression. So your fibrocartilage forms pad-like structures and will be in areas that experience a lot of pressure. So the menisci in your knee, so between your femur and your tibia here, you can see some red. So the red is going to be the fibrocartilage here. And you actually have thick pad-like structures between these two bones, because when you're standing, your weight is pretty much totally on your knees. So we don't need those bones crushing into each other and causing damage, which is why we have these thick pad-like structures that actually resist compression made of fibrocartilage. Those are your menisci. In between our vertebrae, we're going to have fibrocartilage. Again, your spine holds your weight. The further we go down the spine, the more weight these vertebrae have to hold. So we'll have more pad-like structures between our vertebrae to resist that compression. And then our pubic symphysis. So right here between the two halves of our pelvis, we have fibrocartilage as well. It's a thick pad-like structure again between those two halves of the pelvis. In your fibrocartilage, the fibers you're going to find here are thick collagen fibers. And forgive me, I think I forgot to mention when I was talking about the hyaline cartilage. The hyaline cartilage also has collagen fibers, but those are going to be thinner, more difficult to see fibers. So if you're actually looking at a slide of hyaline cartilage, you won't be able to see the collagen fibers there. Whereas if you're looking at a slide of fibrocartilage, that collagen is going to be thicker and you'll be able to see the collagen fibers. So we've talked about the cartilage in the skeletal system and the functions of those cartilage. But what about the functions of the skeletal system as a whole? So obviously your skeleton has a lot of functions. Some of them are fairly obvious, like support. If you didn't have a skeleton, you would just be a pile of tissue and organs, and you can't function like that. So the skeletal system obviously provides support and framework to your body and your soft organs, but it also has a lot of functions that you necessarily might not think about. So in addition to the support, your skeletal system provides protection for your important organs and structures. That's kind of another obvious one. You have your rib cage, which protects your heart and your lungs. You have your skull, which protects your brain, and you have your vertebrae, which help protect your spinal cord. It also provides a point of anchorage. So your skeleton is where your skeletal muscles are going to attach themselves via tendons. If we didn't have our skeleton, there would be nothing for our muscles to attach to. Again, just a big blob of tissue, muscle, and organs, and nobody can live like that. In addition to the support, protection, and anchorage, your skeletal system actually stores some minerals and growth factors. So it provides a reservoir of minerals. The main ones that we would think about here are calcium and phosphate. And if your body is low on calcium or phosphate, then it can actually get these two minerals from your skeletal system and have them released in the blood in their ionic form so that they can be utilized where they're needed. We also have hematopoiesis that takes place in the skeleton. So hematopoiesis is the process of blood cell formation, and that takes place in our red bone marrow. Your skeleton also provides fat storage. So the yellow marrow of the bones is another area where we can store fat. And as we've mentioned before, fat or triglycerides, it's just another form of energy that your body can utilize. Again, that primary source of energy is going to come from our carbohydrates and our glucose. But when needed, we do have that fat storage as a source of energy. And your yellow bone marrow is going to be found in your long bones. In addition to hematopoiesis and fat storage and mineral storage, your bones actually can produce hormones. So specifically, we have osteocalcin. And osteocalcin helps to regulate insulin secretion, glucose homeostasis, and energy expenditure in the body. That's pretty much all we're going to touch on with osteocalcin. We're not really going to get in deep details about this one. However, if you were curious about it and you wanted to learn a bit more, that's going to be mentioned in chapter 16 of your book, where you dive into the endocrine system. So more in Bio 139, we would be going over that. Now, bone classification. You'll also be going over this in the lab portion of our skeletal system. But we have two ways that you can classify the bones. We have regions, so your axial versus your appendicular skeleton, and the shape of the bones. So looking at the regions, you have the axial skeleton, and that's going to be made up of your skull, your rib cage, and your vertebrae. So kind of the main axis of the body, the trunk of the body, is where we're going to have our axial skeleton. Then you have your appendicular skeleton. I'm sure we've all heard our arms and legs be referred to as appendages before. That's because they're part of your appendicular skeleton. So your upper limbs, your arms, your lower limbs, your legs, your shoulder girdle, so your scapula and where it actually comes in contact with your humerus, and your pelvic girdle, so your pelvic bones and where they contact your femur. All of these are going to make up the appendicular skeleton. Now, bone shapes. We have four main categories of bone shapes that we'll be looking at. We have our long bones. Your long bones are going to be bones that are longer than they are wide. So it's in the name, they are long. These are the bones that make up your limbs. So your arms and your legs are made up of long bones, except for the bones in your wrist and the bones in your ankle and your kneecaps or your patella, right in here, which is still part of your leg, but that's not considered a long bone. Then we have short bones. So your short bones are smaller than long bones, and they are roughly cube-shaped. So if we're looking at our skeleton over here, and we go back and look at those wrist bones, and we can't really see the ankle bones here, but we can look at the talus, which is one of our bones in our ankle over here. that's where we're going to find our short bones. They're roughly cube-shaped, so your wrist and your ankle bones. And a type of short bone is a sesamoid bone, and those are sesame seed-shaped bones in the body. That's going to be our patella. We have a couple in the popliteal region behind our knee, and your sesamoid bones are also going to be found inside tendons. Then we have our flat bones, and just like it says in the name, these bones are flat. So the majority of the bones in your skull make up flat bones. Also, our breastbone, which is the sternum right here, is made up of flat bones. Our ribs are flat bones. Even though they have curvature to them, they're still flat. So our ribs are also part of our flat bones. And then our scapulae, which you can't see right here, but they would be behind on the back side of the skeleton. Your scapulae are flat as well, and they are flat bones. Then we have our irregular bones, and your irregular bones don't fit in with long bones, short bones, or flat bones. They are irregularly shaped. So if you're looking at your short bones, keep in mind they're roughly cube-shaped. They're not irregular. But when we look at our vertebrae over here, well, these guys have kind of an entire shape of their own. We've got a squatty body type area that's kind of thick. We have processes going off posteriorly. We have processes coming off transversely. Sometimes we have anterior processes. So they are definitely irregularly shaped and they don't fit into any of the other categories. In addition to the vertebrae, we have our pelvic bones. So your pelvic bones, you might be tempted to call them flat bones. They are not. They are irregular bones. So let's move on to the gross anatomy of bone. So what you can actually see when you're looking at bone structure. So starting off with our compact bone. Your compact bone is going to be this external layer that we see right here. So we're kind of discussing flat bones right here. So we have the skull, and we're zooming in on this little portion right here, and this is what we're looking at. So your compact bone is this external layer of bone that looks fairly solid to the naked eye. Then we have spongy bone, which gets its name because it has all of these little holes in it, this honeycomb type appearance, and that's going to be found internally to compact bone. So we'll have compact bone on the outside and then spongy bone on the inside. So this honeycomb-like structure is made up of small, flat, almost needle-like projections of bone, and it forms trabeculae. So this is a trabeculae. This is a trabeculae. So spongy bone is full of trabeculae. And these open spaces that we see here, this is where we can find bone marrow, red or yellow bone marrow in our spongy bone. Most of the time it's going to be red bone marrow in our spongy bone. Now, this structure that we see here with this kind of sandwiched structure where we have layer of compact bone, spongy bone, layer of compact bone. And by the way, the spongy bone in the center here is referred to as diploe. So that's the term for this kind of sandwiched spongy bone here, diploe. But this is also going to be the structure that you see in short bones and irregular bones. We don't really have a marrow cavity in any of these bones. We're going to have more of this sandwich-like appearance with this thin plate of spongy bone covered by compact bone. Now looking at the structure of a long bone, your long bone is made up of a shaft, two ends, and various membranes. So specifically, this shaft, the center portion of our long bone, is called the diaphysis. You can see we have thick layers of compact bone here on the outside compared to the thin plate of compact bone that we saw in our flat bones. And in the center, we have the medullary cavity. So this is an actual opening in the center of the bone where yellow bone marrow is going to be found. Remember that yellow bone marrow is a form of fat storage. So that's our diaphysis, thick, compact bone, medullary cavity in the middle, full of yellow marrow. The bone ends, so what we'll see on either side of the shaft in the middle, these are called your epiphyses. So this is an epiphysis, and this is an epiphysis. Those are the ends of your long bone. So the outer shell of the epiphysis is going to be compact bone, but in these end areas we will see spongy bone, which we just looked at on the previous slide, full of trabeculae. And in between the epiphysis and the diaphysis, we have the epiphyseal line. The epiphyseal line. And this is in adult bones. The epiphyseal line is the remnant of the epiphyseal plate. So when we start looking at bone growth, this was at one point kind of a plate or a line of cartilage that helped with our bone growth, and we'll go into detail with that in the next lecture. It was a disc of hyaline cartilage. It grows throughout adolescence and your childhood to help lengthen your long bones. So in an adult bone, it's just referred to as the epiphyseal line, which is where that plate used to be. Then on either end, so on the outside of the epiphyses, we have hyaline cartilage. Remember, your hyaline cartilage, one of the types that you'll see is articular cartilage, and that's where it covers the ends of these bones that come in contact with other bones. So it helps to cushion the ends of those bones and absorb some of the stress that can be created in those joints when we're moving. So we have diaphysis, compact bone, medullary cavity, yellow bone marrow, epiphysis, compact bone, spongy bone, epiphyseal line / epiphyseal plate if we're looking at a younger person, and then articular cartilage, which is hyaline cartilage that's going to cover those bone ends. Now, I also said in addition to the shaft and the ends of a long bone, we have specific membranes that we need to discuss. So we have our periosteum. So peri means around and osteo means bone. So your periosteum is this membrane that goes around the outside of your bone. So it is a double membrane, so it has 2 layers to it, covers the entire outside of the bone except for the joint surfaces, because that's where we're going to find our hyaline cartilage. And we have different layers and structures of the periosteum that you need to know. So that's what we have right here. So the very outer layer of the periosteum is referred to as the fibrous layer, and it's made of more dense, irregular connective tissue. Then we have our inner layer of the periosteum, which is the inside that actually touches the bone on the outside, because remember, this is a double membrane. So if we look here, we've got fibrous layer out here, but the portion that actually touches the outside of the bone is our osteogenic layer. That's our inner layer. So your osteogenic layer of your periosteum actually has osteoprogenitor cells. We'll go into more detail about cell types in a bit, but your osteoprogenitor cells are your bone stem cells. So they're your stem cells that make up all of the other types of bone cells. In addition to the stem cells, or those osteoprogenitor cells, you'll also find osteoblasts and osteoclasts in that inner layer of the periosteum. So in our osteogenic layer. Now, I don't know if any of you have broken a bone before. I have. It is a painful thing to experience, and it is not fun. So if you've ever wondered, why do broken bones hurt? And why can they bleed on their own? Why can bones bleed? It's because there's a lot of nerves and blood supply coming to that periosteum. We actually have nutrient arteries coming right in here. But there's also a hole in that periosteum and then a hole in our diaphysis called the nutrient foramen. And that is how we actually get blood supply into our bone, is through that nutrient foramen. So that's where our nutrient artery and vein enter to supply blood to the bone marrow and to the rest of the bone. Now, the periosteum, it is tightly adhered to the bone, okay? So it's not just a membrane that's sitting on the outside of the bone that could potentially slide off. We have Sharpie's fibers, or perforating fibers, if you look over at this image to the far right. We have actual fibers from the periosteum that go into the bone. These are bundles of collagen fibers that extend into the bone matrix. And I've mentioned before, your skeletal system provides an anchorage for your skeletal muscles. So in areas where skeletal muscle actually attaches to bone, where we have those tendons attaching to bone. So tendons are used when you have muscle being attached to bone. If we're talking about a ligament, we are attaching a bone to another bone. So that's the difference between tendons and ligaments. But anyways, an area where skeletal muscle attaches to bone, these perforating fibers are going to be super dense in that area to make sure that when we move, that our skeletal muscles aren't going to pull that periosteum off of our bones. So the periosteum covers the outside of our bones. On the inside of our bones, so inside this medullary cavity here, where our yellow marrow is going to be, we have another covering, and that's called the endosteum. So endosteum is going to be internal on the inside of our bones. So it also, in addition to lining this cavity, it lines the trabeculae in spongy bone. So if we come in here, this lining in our trabeculae, this lining, that's endosteum. So your endosteum, in addition to the osteogenic layer from the periosteum, your endosteum also has the same cells as that layer of the periosteum. So we'll find osteoblasts, osteoclasts, and osteoprogenitor cells in the endosteum. So the bone marrow types that you can find, I've briefly mentioned both of them. We have our yellow marrow. Your yellow marrow is going to be found in your long bones, in that medullary cavity. And it's another type of energy storage. So this is where we can store some extra fat for energy when needed, in that yellow marrow in our long bones. We also have red marrow. So your red marrow is going to be your hematopoietic tissue. So your red marrow is what actually forms your blood cells. It's a blood-forming tissue. In adults, your red marrow is going to be found in flat bones. So remember the structure of the flat bone that we went over just a minute ago. In the heads of the femur and in the heads of the humerus. In infants, you'll find your red marrow in the medullary cavity of long bones. So we don't have fat storage quite yet in infants. And you'll also find it in spongy bone. In adults, you only find it in the trabeculae and spongy bone. However, if you have somebody who is very anemic, so they have low oxygen carrying capacity in their current supply of red blood cells, then that yellow marrow can revert back to red marrow so that they can produce more red blood cells and carry more oxygen throughout their body. So yellow marrow, fat storage, medullary cavity and long bones. Red marrow, hematopoietic tissue, and it's going to be found in your spongy bone. Bone markings. So bone markings are different areas on the bone where we can have attachments to muscles, attachments to tendons, and attachments to ligaments. And we have 3 types of bone markings. We have projections. So projections are going to be sites of actual muscle and ligament attachment. We have surfaces that help to form joints. And then we have depressions and openings. And this is where blood vessels and nerves are going to pass through these bones. In the lab portion of the skeletal system, you actually have to learn all of these markings. This table 6.2 in your book is a fantastic resource for actually teaching you what those markings mean. So when you're going through and you're reading about your tibial tuberosity, it just sounds like a word and it has no significance. But if you come in here, you actually learn that a tuberosity is a large rounded projection. So if you go down below your knee, this is at least on my leg, if I go below my knee, below my patella, and I start feeling on my tibia, it actually feels like my tibia kind of comes to a point. And it does. It kind of looks a little bit triangular when you're looking at the bone itself. But that little roughened, rounded projection that I can feel on my tibia, that's your tibial tuberosity, which makes sense when you look at what that marking actually means. So I recommend that you go through table 6.2 and take time to familiarize yourself with what these words actually mean, because it will help identifying the markings and remembering the markings. It'll definitely help you recall them and make much more sense of it. So we've got projections, surfaces that form joints, and depressions and openings as our 3 different types of bone markings. So looking at microscopic anatomy of the bone. So we have 3, but 4 types of bone cells that you need to be aware of. So we have that stem cell, our bone stem cell, which is an osteogenic cell. And remember, we find these guys in the periosteum and the endosteum. So that membrane that's associated with our long bones on the inside and the outside, or the outside and the inside. Your osteogenic cells are going to look like squamous cells. And once they are stimulated, so it would look like our short, squatty, squamous cells right here. Once they're stimulated, they turn into osteoblasts. So your osteoblasts are your bone-forming cells. So these are the cells that actually secrete the bone matrix. And when they're active, they look like cubes. So they have a cuboidal shape to them. So the matrix that the osteoblasts actually synthesize and secrete, it's unmineralized, and it's made up of collagen, which is 90% of the protein that you're going to find in the bone, and calcium binding proteins. So they're stimulated, they secrete this matrix. At some point, they are actually going to end up being surrounded by the matrix that they've secreted. So they kind of wall themselves in, these osteoblasts. And at that point, they're going to turn into osteocytes. So your osteocytes are these, your book refers to them as spider-shaped. So these spider-shaped cells, these are your mature bone cells. And when we were talking about cartilage before, and the chondrocytes, or those mature cartilage cells, they live in lacunae, or little depressions, little pockets. Your osteocytes also live in lacunae. So they live in these little pockets. So your osteocytes monitor and help to maintain the bone matrix. So they act as stress or strain receptors. And if they encounter any stress or strain, they can help your bone respond to that mechanical stimuli. So they'll actually send signals to different cells that are responsible for bone remodeling. So stressed bone can actually be broken down or made as needed. And remodeling is, in addition to that happening with stressed bone, remodeling is also necessary for calcium homeostasis, which we will discuss later on in chapter 6. So our last type of bone cell are these osteoclasts, and they look way different from the 3 cells that we've already discussed. So these osteoclasts are giant. They're very large, and they're multinucleated. So you can see each of these cell types just has one nucleus. That osteoclast has many nuclei. And these are your bone resorbing cells. So they're actually derived from the same cell line, the same white blood cell line that macrophages come from. And if you think about the function of a macrophage, your macrophage is going to go in and gobble things up that it finds. It goes and it grabs onto bacteria and it phagocytizes them. So your bone resorbing cells, your osteoclasts, are actually going to gobble up bone. They have this ruffled border that you can see here. This is the side of your osteoclast that's actually going to come in contact with bone. And you can kind of think of them like little microvilli. They aren't actually microvilli, but they serve the same function. So they increase the surface area of this cell in order to assist with enzymatic degradation of bone. So we've got our osteogenic cells, our osteoblasts, which secrete our bone matrix, our osteocytes, which are our mature bone cells that help to monitor and make sure everything's functioning the way it should and sends signals when things aren't functioning the way that they should. And then we have our osteoclasts, which help to resorb bone. So moving on to actual compact bone. We'll look at the structure of a compact bone. So the functional unit or the structural unit of bone is referred to as the osteon or the Haversian system. We also go over some of this in lab as well. So the osteon, if we look over here at this long bone or this compact bone in the long bone, these big circles, these big cylindrical structures that we see, this is an osteon. This is an actual histological image of bone, and this is an osteon. That whole thing, that's a structural unit of bone. So they run parallel to the axis of long bones. So however long your long bone is, that's how long your osteons are. And they function as weight-bearing pillars that help to make up that bone. So they give or help to give your bone the ability to bear weight. Now, if we're looking at the osteon itself, let's move over to this image to the left. We have these concentric circles that run around the center of this osteon. And these concentric circles are referred to as your lamellae. And they are made up of collagen fibers. So if we look right here, you can actually see your collagen fibers in each lamellae run in opposite directions. So they run in the same direction within the same lamellae, but then if we move out to the next one, they run in the opposite direction. And then if we move out to the next one, they move back in the direction as the one before. So having these collagen fibers run in different directions helps your bone resist twisting forces or torsional forces. So I can put my fist down on something and then twist my arm, and it's not going to break the bones in my arm. It's not going to break my ulna and my radius or my humerus. And one of the reasons why is the direction that these collagen fibers run in your lamellae. And the space between these collagen fibers is made up of crystals of bone salts that come in and fill up the space between the fibers. So we have these lamellae that run in these concentric circles, but what are they running around? We have the central canal in the middle of the osteon. You can see in all of these images. Your central canal is going to be where your blood and nerve supply runs. If we look at kind of this cross section of our compact bone, you can also see, so this is the central canal. This is a central canal of an osteon. But then we have these little canals that come off to the side of our central canal and kind of run perpendicular. And these are called your perforating canals. So they run from the central canal of an osteon to the medullary cavity to connect the blood supply from those central canals to your medullary cavity. So that's how we get blood from our central canals or from our osteons into other parts of bone through those perforating canals. If we look down at our histological image over here, you see these dark spots going around in our lamellae, around that central canal of the osteon, and those are actually your osteocytes, so your mature bone cells sitting in lacunae. They're going to be found at the junctions of lamellae. So when we have one circle and we're going to the next circle, that's where you'll find your osteocytes and lacunae around there. In addition to our lamellae going in concentric circles, we have little canals that radiate from our central canal all the way through the layers of lamellae, through the entire osteon, and those are called canaliculi. So your canaliculi actually radiate from the lacunae that your osteocytes are sitting in, and they help to connect all of the lacunae to that central canal. So your canaliculi actually allow your osteocytes to be able to communicate with each other. Remember I said that your osteocytes sense stress and send signals? Well, they can do that because of these canaliculi actually connecting all of the osteocytes to each other. It's almost like the canaliculi allow the osteocytes to hold hands and be able to communicate with each other in that way, which they wouldn't be able to do without the canaliculi because they're in little depressions or little pockets made of hard bone. So we already talked about our concentric lamellae, the ones that go in a little circle within the osteon. We have two other types of lamellae. We have interstitial lamellae, and that's actually lamellae that are in between osteons. So if you can see where my laser pointer is pointing right here, these in between osteons lamellae. And those are usually remnants from bone remodeling processes, your interstitial lamellae. Then our final type of lamellae is going to be circumferential lamellae. So these guys you're going to find just deep to the periosteum. So here we have our periosteum, our outer membrane covering our bone, and right below that, when we get to our compact bone, we're going to have these huge lamellae that run the entire circumference of that long bone. So that's our circumferential lamellae. And these help to resist twisting forces, in addition to the way that those collagen fibers run in our osteons, in our concentric lamellae. So we have concentric, interstitial, and circumferential lamellae. So that's the overall structure of the osteon. There are quite a few parts to be aware of, but they all work together to give us blood supply to our bones, to give us the strength so that our bones just don't break all the time. The structure of the compact bone is very important. In addition to the actual physical structure of the bone, we have chemical composition of the bone. And that's made up of organic components and inorganic components. So for our organic components, that's going to be the cell types that we already discussed, our osteoprogenitor cells, our osteoblasts, osteoclasts, and osteocytes, but also the osteoid. And the osteoid is the bone matrix that is secreted by those osteoblasts. So the main component of the osteoid is going to be collagen. That's the organic part of the bone matrix. And that collagen is going to contribute to structure and flexibility within the bone, and again, resist those stretching and twisting forces. It's those collagen fibers and our concentric lamellae that help resist the twisting forces. And these collagen fibers have what's called sacrificial bonds. So the bonds between these collagen molecules can actually easily break, and that helps to dissipate some of the energy that is encountered when we have these high twisting forces, and it prevents the force from being great enough to cause a fracture. So collagen has sacrificial bonds. And these bonds aren't just gone. As long as the trauma stops and it's not consistent and it doesn't necessarily occur all the time or repeat all the time, then those sacrificial bonds can reform between our collagen molecules. So that's our organic components. Then we also have inorganic components of bone, and that's going to be our hydroxyapatites, or the mineral salts that help to make up bone. And the main part of these hydroxyapatites are going to be calcium phosphates. So your calcium phosphates are going to form tiny needle-like crystals that are tightly packed in around the collagen fibers. So remember, we talked about the mineral salts being in between those collagen fibers in our concentric lamellae. Well, that's our calcium phosphate crystals. So the inorganic component of bone, these hydroxyapatites, our calcium phosphates, these mineral salts, that's what actually makes your bone hard. So the organic components help to resist twisting and stretch. The inorganic components of bone help to resist compression. So it makes our bone really hard. And interestingly enough, the calcium phosphate crystals in bone, your mineral salts, are why bones don't degrade quickly after death. They're the reason that our bones still exist hundreds of years after we die and don't just break down. It's because of these mineral salts. That's all I have for the first part of chapter 6. So just to kind of